Lamentations. Introduction. A lament is an expression of grief or sorrow or complaint. This book is sometimes called the Lamentations of Jeremiah, reflecting the traditional view that the book of Lamentations was written by Jeremiah. Now, the book itself doesn't name its author, but there are some obvious similarities with Lamentations and Jeremiah. And although we can't be absolutely certain, it seems likely that Jeremiah was the author of Lamentations. Lamentations, as the name suggests, is one of the saddest books of the Old Testament, written in response to the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. This book describes the horror of the exile. Although it recognizes that the events of the exile are well deserved because of the sin of the people, Lamentations expresses deep anguish over Jerusalem's destruction and the exile of the people. It's written from the perspective of those who've been left behind in the land. Each of the 5 chapters of Lamentations is a poem, and for that reason, the book of Lamentations is sometimes grouped with the other poetic books of the Old Testament. The first 4 poems are acrostics, that is, the lines begin with successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet, a sort of A to Z. The 5th poem has 22 lines, like an acrostic, because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, but it isn't an acrostic. It's more like one of the Psalms of lament. Lamentations is grouped with the prophetic books in our English Old Testament, partly because it was attributed to Jeremiah, but also because of its prophetic character. This book wrestles, as the prophets did, with the question of where is God in this situation? The book of Jeremiah anticipates and describes the exile. The book of Lamentations looks back and reflects on the exile. Lamentations highlights God's sovereignty. It describes justice and judgment. It describes sin and repentance, and questions if God has abandoned his people. It asks about Israel's enemies, who also deserve God's punishment. And it promises hope of God's future blessing. An outline of Lamentations. The book divides into 5 parts because there are 5 poems. First of all, then, chapter 1, a city mourns. Chapter 2, God is like an enemy. Chapter 3, glimpses of hope. Chapter 4, ongoing suffering and a spark of relief. And then finally a prayer, please Lord help, chapter 5. By the way, the structure of Lamentations appears to highlight the 3rd lament, which contains the most hopeful statements in the whole book. It's not all doom and gloom. It's quite possible that you're unfamiliar with the contents of Lamentations, but you may well recognize these words from the middle of the 3rd chapter. Listen to this. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. Well, finally, let's think about the importance of Lamentations for Christians. The book of Lamentations is a book about suffering, but it's not a book about suffering in a general sense. The fact that human beings suffer because we live in a broken, sin-sick world. No, this is a book about deserved suffering, suffering for sin. It's not like the book of Job, a book about righteous suffering. Lamentations confronts us with the fearful reality that God is rightly angry because of our sin, and that God will punish it. This book reminds us of the horror of God's punishment for sin. It reminds us that God's day of judgment is fast approaching. But it also reminds us that God is a faithful, compassionate, and loving God. And that faithfulness, compassion, and love are ultimately seen in the death of Jesus on the cross many hundreds of years later. Because it was there that God provided a way for sin to be forgiven. It was there that God punished his own dear Son for our sin. It was there that we were given eternal hope. See, it's ultimately in Jesus that we experience that God's compassions are new every morning. Lamentations reminds us that when it comes to sin, our only hope is in God's good character. And it's at the cross of Jesus where his wrath and his mercy finally meet.